Welcome to Smart City Viewpoints at ARC Advisory Group. I'm Larry O'Brien, Vice President of Research at ARC Advisory Group. And our guest today on our first episode is my colleague, Jim Frazer, Vice President of Smart Cities. Good morning, Jim.
Thank you, Larry.
So our topic today is defining and planning your smart city efforts. And Jim, I'd like to start off with the first question, and it's a pretty basic one. What is a smart city?
Well, Larry, hey, thanks. That's a great introductory question. It's a public agency that cities, counties, states, provincial entities, nations that embrace IoT to drive digital transformation within their organization and perhaps even more importantly, with other impacted community members. A public agency touches a lot of private interests as well. There are a range of definitions of smart cities. It's a somewhat of an ambiguous term. One of the definitions we like the best actually comes from the Smart Cities Council, and it includes 9 vertical applications that are required in a smart city. And basically it covers the functions of a public agency. So let me cover some of those. The first is the built environment. That's all of a city's buildings, parks, public spaces, schools, firehouses, police stations, hospitals, including all of those embedded electronic control systems within those facilities, like HVAC, security, lighting. They're all important parts of that domain. So the built environment, basically buildings, are number one. Then we have energy infrastructure. That's the everything from the substation on down, street lighting, gas, distribution assets, metering of municipally owned utilities and rural co-ops, microgrids and energy storage, as well as photovoltaic and wind power, are also increasingly important in that domain. Number 2, energy infrastructure. Then, of course, there's number 3, telecommunications. That's critical for safety and well-being, as well as for economic vitality of the community, both business and private. Broadband is, as we all know, a topic of huge discussion in this domain. It's critical for just about every business activity, as well as safety issues. In terms of business activities, broadband brings in businesses of call centers, retail distribution hubs, server farms, medical imaging, and a range of different high-wage jobs that drive the revenue of a city. Because remember, cities do get their revenue from taxes in terms of sales taxes, income taxes, and property taxes. Then number 4 in those verticals is transportation and mobility. And in many cases, this is the largest component of a smart city. So remember that roads, streets, bike lanes, vehicles, public transport, ports are all critical parts of a city. And as we all undoubtedly know, there are some very dramatic paradigm shifts that are happening in the domains of mobility, from Uber and Lyft to mobility as a service initiatives that integrate everything from bike share and bike rental and scooters to light rail. Coming in the very near future, and actually there have already been some deployments of connected vehicle technology that drives a number of safety applications. And a little farther out, we've all heard about autonomous vehicles, whether it be autonomous shuttles for people, or perhaps even sooner will be autonomous vehicle deliveries of food, for example. Then, of course, there's a range of more traditional government services that you would think of in terms of a smart city, but the IoT and digital transformation can impact all of these just as dramatically. That includes health and human services, including telemedicine, educational virtualization. As we know, college education, and even public school and education is getting increasingly expensive, and serving that remotely in a virtualized manner is certainly on the rise, including, and perhaps most importantly, to rural environments. Then, of course, there's water and wastewater. That's the collection, distribution, metering, and reclamation of water, monitoring water purity and cleanliness. There's waste management. There's an awful lot of packaged products that are bought and used today. So the collection, distribution, reuse, and recycling of that waste material is very important. Incinerators and landfills are increasingly viewed as a non-optimum way of processing the waste stream. So IoT can help that in terms of even methane gas generation at a landfill. Public safety. Public safety infrastructure includes police, fire, and EMS first responders, as well as disaster prevention and management agencies, courts and correction facilities. It even trickles down to law enforcement body cams, as well as IoT-enabled gunshot detectors. And lastly, payments and finance. Perhaps the lowest hanging fruit in the smart city domain is simply moving from paper-based bills to online bill payment. It's almost a one-time cost with very low maintenance, and it is probably the first thing that a smart city entity should do. Now, those are all the applications. The IoT and digital transformation domain is not itself one ubiquitous effort. There's a couple of technologies, actually 7, that impact all of those 9 applications. So instrumentation and controls are obvious, are an obvious requirement. It's how a smart city monitors and controls conditions. It provides the eyes and ears. And good examples include smart meters for electricity, water, and gas, air quality sensors, high quality video for traffic monitoring, people monitoring, roadway sensors, as well as the more traditional switches, breakers, and other electrical devices that operators can remotely control. So instrumentation and control is perhaps the most foundational piece. Then, of course, number 2, you need connectivity. Is it low bandwidth? Is it high bandwidth? Is it Wi-Fi? Is it a mesh network? There's a number of questions around that domain. Do you use cellular? Interoperability is a third technology issue. Interoperability really means having all 7 layers of a connection be interoperable. In a very simple sense, that ranges from your connector must match to at layer 7, the application must match. So you could, in a simple example, you could use the same character set, say alphanumeric characters, but if one person's speaking French and one speaking English, well, the communication is difficult. Cybersecurity and privacy are an ecosystem of technologies, policies, and practices that safeguard data, privacy, and assets. A city really should publish clear privacy rules and should implement a robust cybersecurity system. Both of these play a very critical role in enabling smart cities because they build trust. And without trust, the city may have difficulty moving some of these initiatives forward. Then, of course, there's data management, computing resources, and analytics that together drive the business intelligence that allow you to actualize on this information that you've created out of the raw data. Is that enough, Larry?
Yeah, that's a lot. And I know if I was an owner operator, I might, or an end user, it's a real challenge, from that perspective about how to get started. This is an awfully It's an awfully big landscape of technologies and functions that you've laid out. So how do you get started? How do you ensure a successful project when you're thinking about implementing smart city technology?
Good question. Larry, the smart city initiatives have been around for at least a decade. And it's that the implementation philosophy has evolved. In the first wave of initiatives, it really was suppliers that went out to the market, to the public works directors, to the city managers, to the elected officials, and even to citizens groups, and attempted to deploy their applications. However, they met with quite a bit of pushback, and were not as successful as they would have liked. And what they recognized was that they really didn't embrace the needs of the community. It was more of the scenario that they built a hammer and then everything looked like a nail. So that evolved to a Smart City 2.0 perspective, where those suppliers went to the public elected officials, the city managers, maybe directors of an agency, and asked, what is it, with a clean sheet of paper, what is it you want? That was quite a bit more successful, but it too struggled, because even a public official or a public works director don't have a complete view of what are the needs of the community. So the Smart City 3.0 effort really started gaining traction 2 or 3 years ago. I believe it was coined by Dr. Boyd Cohen. He's a professor in Spain. And it is a all-encompassing initiative of user needs from all the stakeholder communities. So while Smart City 1.0, supplier-driven, and 2.0 are driven by government decisions, Smart City 3.0 is really driven by a comprehensive group of all of the stakeholder needs. So that eliminates, in a simple example, that eliminates the problem. You might say you're building a bridge. You don't want to build a bridge and then have the bicycle community later on come to you and say, "Hey, there's no bike lane. We think this thing's a failure," or we're not going to support the bond issue that is funding it. So that's that Smart City 3.0 approach is very important to actually making projects happen, and after implementation being viewed as being ultimately successful.
And it sounds like maybe helping some of the end users and owner operators avoid some common mistakes maybe too. Has a structured approach to Smart City 3.0 been formalized yet?
That's a fascinating question, and there are a number of initiatives in that area. I'll talk about two. Previously I referenced the transportation domain, and in North America, the U.S. Department of Transportation faced many of these same issues with their goal of moving people and freight through the network in a safer and more efficient manner. And early on, they recognized that the costs of integration were orders of magnitude larger than the actual hardware and software costs. So they took a good hard look about how do we address that problem. And what they came up with was an implementation of the systems engineering process. And for those computer science people in our audience, you might remember the Waterfall Model from school. Some still use it. And their adoption of that is a 3-step process. It's to, in step 1, comprehensively define your stakeholder communities. So that's everything from the business community, the elected officials, the taxpayers, the voting community, the bicycle community, the police, fire, EMS, public works directors, the elected officials, and any other entities that might impact the situation. There might be a local college in town or major employers. The first step is to define all those stakeholder communities and then somewhat exhaustively query them for what is your biggest problem? What is your need? If you had a magic wand, what would you fix today, tomorrow, and perhaps years into the future? Well, in that step, you collect all of those, and then you refine your somewhat substantial list into which ones have consensus across the communities. Once you have that consensus-based needs list, that finishes step one. In step two, a systems engineer will transfer them and evolve them into measurable functional requirements. And that too is a very critical step, because that then forms the basis of your RFP or your project specification. And then in step three, which is a little more elegant and fine-tuned, is developing test plans so that as you move through your project lifecycle, you don't deviate you don't deviate from support of those originally agreed upon list of consensus-based needs. You don't want to finish your project and either not support one of those or perhaps work in some requirements that are not supported by a need, because that doesn't make financial sense either. So the US DOT is driving quite a bit of smart city efforts in the digital transformation domain using that approach. More recently, the IEEE has recognized that there needs to be a guide for what do you do on day one. And not surprisingly, they've developed and are adopting essentially the same type of philosophy, where it's define your stakeholder communities, extract those consensus-based needs, turn it into measurable requirements, and have some oversight all along the project life so that you don't deviate. So in the next quarter or two, the IEEE will be publishing an umbrella standard for smart city planning and technology that addresses that as well. But that's only two of a number of different initiatives that are attempting to take out the ambiguity of what you do on day one, in week one, and in month one of your smart city project.
Okay. Well, hopefully that'll give us all a better foundation to actually, get started on some of these projects. It's really hard to have an effective project without that requirements definition. I know that for sure. I think we have time for one last question, and I was wondering if you could comment about sustainability within the smart city domain.
That's a great question, because it's not in smart city initiatives often the community defaults to some of the most easily monetizable applications: energy conservation, reduction in maintenance, but safety, quality of life, all are also very important in creating a dynamic structure, both socially and economically, for a city. So sustainability isn't just a green buzzword. It actually has three formal pillars. And the first is to protect or enhance the natural environment. The second is to protect and enhance human quality of life, the societal aspects, and that includes safety. Part of the smart city effort is Vision Zero, which is a worldwide initiative to bring pedestrian fatalities and accidents down to a level of zero. And all of that is also in the smart city domain. That's pillar number two. Pillar number three in the world of sustainability is really the one that's most unspoken about. And it's doing the first two in an economically sustainable manner. So practically speaking, it needs to get paid for in a reasonable time frame with a relatively short payback, or you're not going to achieve the first two of better quality of life and better environment and more jobs. So that's sustainability isn't as a fuzzy a term as you may think. It's really baked into the smart city effort. Does that answer your question, Larry?
Makes sense, and I think it definitely should be baked into that smart city effort. At the end of the day, I think it's all about quality of life for citizens and making sure we have a sustainable environment moving forward. So it makes sense to me. And that our time today is just about up for this episode. Jim, I want to thank you for your time today.
Hey, thanks, Larry.
And I'm sure this is just the first of many podcasts that we're going to do with the ARC Smart Cities team. And I'd like to invite you to please join us for future Smart City Viewpoints podcasts. And don't forget to visit us online at www.arcweb.com, ARCWEB/industries/smart-cities. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Smart City VWPTS, Smart City Viewpoints VWPTS, all one word on Twitter. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much, Larry.
Thank you.